The fluorescent lights of the downtown police station buzzed overhead as Sarah Martinez slumped in the hard plastic chair, her unwashed hair falling like a curtain across her face. The officers who had brought her in whispered among themselves, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch fragments of their conversation. "Another junkie causing problems at the grocery store," Officer Thompson muttered, shaking his head as he filled out paperwork. "Manager says she's been hanging around for weeks, scaring off customers." "What's the point?" His partner, Officer Rodriguez, replied with a heavy sigh. "We'll book her. She'll be out tomorrow, back on the streets by evening." Same cycle over and over. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, her fingers unconsciously pulling at the high collar of her torn jacket. She had heard it all before. The looks of disgust, the muttered comments, the assumption that she was just another drug addict taking up space and resources. At 26, she looked at least a decade older, her face gaunt and marked by the harsh realities of street life. The grocery store incident had been a misunderstanding, but trying to explain that to anyone seemed pointless now. She had been standing near the entrance, not panhandling or bothering anyone, just trying to stay warm while she figured out where to spend the night. When a customer dropped their wallet, Sarah had picked it up and tried to return it, but the woman had screamed, accusing her of attempted theft. Security had been called, then the police, and now here she was again. "Sarah Martinez," Officer Thompson called out, not bothering to look up from his computer screen. 26 years old, multiple arrests for trespassing, vagrancy, public intoxication. No fixed address. He finally glanced at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and resignation. "You know the drill by now, don't you?" She nodded silently, having learned long ago that talking back or trying to defend herself only made things worse. The system had labeled her, filed her away in a neat category that made it easy to dismiss her humanity. She was a statistic, a recurring problem, a waste of space that nobody wanted to deal with. As they processed her for the night, Sarah's mind drifted to memories of a different life. There had been a time when she had dreams, when she had believed in possibilities beyond mere survival. She remembered her high school graduation, her mother's proud smile, the acceptance letter to community college that had felt like a golden ticket to a better future. That was before everything fell apart, before her mother's cancer diagnosis and the medical bills that drained their savings, before she had to choose between her education and helping pay for treatment, before her mother died anyway, leaving Sarah alone and drowning in debt, before the depression hit like a freight train, making it impossible to hold down the part-time jobs that barely paid rent on their tiny apartment. The downward spiral had been swift and merciless. Late rent payments led to eviction. Eviction led to sleeping in her car until it was repossessed. The streets became her only option, and once you ended up there, climbing back out seemed impossible. Every day was about survival, about finding food, shelter, safety. Long-term planning became a luxury she couldn't afford. "Hey, Martinez." Officer Rodriguez's voice cut through her memories. "You listening? I said you can make your phone call now." Sarah looked up, realizing she had been staring at the wall for several minutes. "I don't have anyone to call," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from disuse. She couldn't remember the last time she had spoken more than a few words to anyone. The officer's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. "Well, you're spending the night either way. Hopefully you'll think twice before causing trouble again." As they led her to the holding cell, Sarah caught sight of herself in the reflection of a window. The person staring back was barely recognizable as the young woman she had once been. Dark circles ringed her eyes. Her cheekbones were sharp from months of inconsistent meals, and her clothes hung loosely on her diminished frame. She understood why people looked at her with fear or disgust. She had become invisible, a ghost haunting the margins of society. The holding cell was small and cold, with a thin mattress on a metal bench and a toilet that had seen better days. Sarah had spent enough nights in similar cells that the routine was familiar. She curled up on the mattress, pulling her jacket tighter around herself, careful to keep the collar high. Other women came and went throughout the night. A young woman arrested for shoplifting baby formula sobbed quietly in the corner, explaining to anyone who would listen that her infant was hungry and she had no money left after paying rent. An older woman with wild gray hair muttered to herself about conspiracy theories and government surveillance. Two teenagers, clearly high on something, giggled inappropriately at everything around them. Each woman had a story, Sarah knew, but the system wasn't interested in stories. It was interested in categories, in processing people through as quickly and efficiently as possible. Compassion was a luxury that overworked officers and overcrowded facilities couldn't afford. As dawn approached, Sarah finally dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with fragments of her past life. She dreamed of her mother's laugh, of Sunday mornings spent reading the newspaper together, of plans for the future that had seemed so achievable back then. She dreamed of her old bedroom, with its posters of far-off places she had hoped to visit someday, and the journal where she had written her thoughts and aspirations. Those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone naive enough to believe that hard work and good intentions were enough to guarantee success. The streets had taught her different lessons. They had taught her that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, circumstances beyond your control can destroy everything you've built. They had taught her that society's safety net had gaping holes, and once you fell through, clawing your way back up was nearly impossible. She woke to the sound of keys jangling and Officer Thompson's voice calling out names for release. "Martinez, you're up. Try to stay out of trouble for more than a week this time, will you?" Sarah gathered her few belongings, a small backpack containing everything she owned in the world. A change of clothes, a toothbrush she had found in a gas station bathroom, a photograph of her mother that was worn soft from handling, and a small notebook where she sometimes wrote down thoughts when the loneliness became unbearable. Walking out of the police station into the gray morning light, Sarah felt the familiar weight of hopelessness settling on her shoulders. The day stretched ahead of her with its endless challenges. Where to find food, where to use a bathroom, where to sit without being told to move along, where to spend the night. The simple acts of existing had become a complex navigation of rules and restrictions that seemed designed to make life impossible for people like her. She started walking toward the downtown area, where there was at least some foot traffic and the possibility of finding a few dollars in drop change. Her stomach cramped with hunger, reminding her that she hadn't eaten anything substantial in 2 days. The collar of her jacket chafed against the sensitive skin of her neck, but she endured the discomfort rather than adjust it. As she walked, Sarah noticed people going about their normal morning routines. Commuters hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases, their faces focused on phones or lost in thought about the day ahead. A mother pushed a stroller while talking to a toddler about what they would do at the park. An elderly man fed pigeons on a bench, smiling as the birds flocked around him. These glimpses of normal life felt like looking through a window at a world she could no longer access. She had become separate from it, existing in the same physical space but inhabiting a completely different reality. To them, she was at best invisible, at worst a problem to be avoided. The morning sun climbed higher, and Sarah found herself standing outside the same grocery store where yesterday's incident had occurred. She could see through the windows to the bright, clean aisles filled with abundance. The contrast between that world and her own felt almost absurd. Here was a place overflowing with food, while just outside, people went hungry. Here was warmth and shelter, while outside, people sought any refuge from the elements. She turned away and continued walking, knowing that lingering would only invite more trouble. The day was beginning, and with it came the familiar struggle to survive just one more day in a world that had decided she didn't belong in it. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself in the emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital, her body racked with fever and chills that had been building for days. She had tried to tough it out, knowing that medical bills were impossible when you had no income and no insurance. But the infection in her lungs had finally overwhelmed her weakened immune system. The triage nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes named Patricia, had seen Sarah come in. Unlike many healthcare workers who had grown callous to the stream of homeless patients, Patricia took time to really look at each person who came through her doors. "How long have you been feeling sick, honey?" Patricia asked gently, noting Sarah's elevated temperature and labored breathing. "Maybe a week," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought it would get better on its own." Patricia's heart ached as she looked at this young woman who was clearly malnourished and exhausted. She had worked in emergency medicine for 15 years and had seen too many people like Sarah, people who waited until they were dying to seek help because they had nowhere else to turn. "We're going to take good care of you," Patricia assured her, making a note in Sarah's file. "The doctor will see you soon." Dr. Jennifer Walsh was finishing up her third consecutive 12-hour shift when Patricia brought her Sarah's chart. At 38, Dr. Walsh had dedicated her career to emergency medicine specifically because she wanted to help people who had nowhere else to go. She had grown up in poverty herself and understood how quickly circumstances could change someone's life trajectory. Pneumonia, likely bacterial, Dr. Walsh diagnosed after examining Sarah and reviewing her chest x-rays. "We'll need to admit her for 4 antibiotics. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished as well." As they prepared to move Sarah to a room, Dr. Walsh noticed something that made her pause. While adjusting Sarah's hospital gown, she caught a glimpse of what looked like old scarring around her neck. The marks were mostly hidden by Sarah's careful positioning and the way she instinctively kept her collar high, even in the hospital bed. "Sarah," Dr. Walsh said carefully, "I need to examine your neck area to check for any swelling that might affect your breathing." Sarah's eyes filled with panic, and she clutched at her gown. "No, please. It's fine. I can breathe okay." But Dr. Walsh had seen enough trauma cases to recognize the signs. The scars were old but distinctive, and they told a story that explained so much about Sarah's current situation. With gentle persistence and Patricia's help, they were able to examine the area properly. What they found made both medical professionals step back in shock. Around Sarah's neck were the unmistakable marks of attempted strangulation, old but severe enough to have caused permanent damage to her throat and surrounding tissue. But that wasn't all. There were also burn marks, precise and deliberate, forming a pattern that suggested systematic torture rather than a single violent incident. "Sarah," Dr. Walsh said softly, sitting down beside the bed. "These injuries, how did they happen?" For the first time in months, Sarah broke down completely. The walls she had built to protect herself from further hurt crumbled, and the story poured out between sobs and gasps for air. She told them about Marcus, the man she had met 2 years ago when she was still living in a tiny apartment and working 2 part-time jobs to stay afloat after her mother's death. He had seemed like salvation at first, charming and attentive, offering her emotional support during the darkest period of her life. "He said he loved me," Sarah whispered, her fingers unconsciously touching her throat. "He said he wanted to take care of me, that I didn't need to work so hard or struggle so much. I was so tired of fighting for everything, so tired of being alone." The relationship had moved quickly. Marcus convinced her to quit her jobs, telling her he made enough money to support them both. He isolated her from the few friends she had left, claiming they were jealous of their relationship and didn't want her to be happy. When she expressed doubts or tried to maintain some independence, he became increasingly controlling and possessive. "It started small," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to speak the truth. "He would criticize my clothes, my hair, the way I talked to other people. He said it was because he cared about me, because he wanted me to be the best version of myself." But the control escalated quickly to violence. The first time he hit her, Marcus cried and apologized, swearing it would never happen again. He blamed stress from work, promised to get help, bought her flowers and expensive gifts. Sarah, still grieving her mother and desperately lonely, wanted to believe him. The physical abuse became more frequent and more severe. Marcus had a particular fascination with her neck, often choking her during his rages until she lost consciousness. He would burn her with cigarettes, always in places that could be easily hidden by clothing. He documented his abuse with photographs, threatening to share them if she ever tried to leave. "He said no one would ever want me after what he had done to me," Sarah said, her voice becoming steady as she spoke the words she had never said aloud before. "He said I was damaged goods, that I should be grateful he was willing to stay with me." Dr. Walsh and Patricia listened with a combination of professional composure and personal horror. They had both seen domestic violence cases before, but the systematic nature of Sarah's abuse was particularly chilling. "How did you get away?" Patricia asked gently. Sarah's face darkened. "I didn't choose to leave. One night, Marcus went too far. He choked me until I passed out, and when I woke up, I was in the hospital. A neighbor had heard the noise and called the police. But even then, her nightmare wasn't over. Marcus had been arrested, but he was released on bail while awaiting trial. The apartment had been in his name, and Sarah had no legal right to stay there. With no job, no savings, and injuries that made working difficult, she had nowhere to go. The domestic violence shelter was full, Sarah explained. There was a waiting list, and they said it might be weeks before a bed opened up. I stayed with a friend for a few days, but Marcus found out where I was. He threatened her family, so I had to leave. That was when Sarah's descent into homelessness began in earnest. With visible injuries that hadn't healed properly and gaps in her employment history, finding work became nearly impossible. The psychological trauma made it difficult to trust anyone or form the connections necessary to rebuild her life. I tried to get help, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. I went to social services, to victim advocate organizations, to churches. But there were always waiting lists, or forms to fill out, or requirements I couldn't meet because I didn't have an address or a phone number or documentation that I had lost when I left Marcus. Dr. Walsh felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same anger she felt every time she saw how the system failed the people who needed it most. Sarah hadn't chosen to become homeless. She had been systematically destroyed by someone who claimed to love her, then abandoned by institutions that should have protected her. What happened to Marcus? Patricia asked. Sarah's laugh was bitter. He pled down to a misdemeanor assault charge. 6 months in county jail, suspended sentence, probation. His lawyer argued that I was an unreliable witness because I was homeless and had been treated for depression. The judge seemed to agree. The injustice of it was staggering. Marcus was living free while Sarah suffered the consequences of his violence every single day. Her injuries had healed badly without proper medical care, leaving her with chronic pain and difficulty swallowing. The psychological trauma had never been addressed, leaving her hypervigilant and unable to trust anyone enough to accept help. Sarah, Dr. Walsh said firmly, what happened to you was not your fault. None of it. Not the abuse, not losing your home, not ending up on the streets. You are a survivor, and you deserve so much better than what this world has given you. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a flicker of something she had thought was dead forever. It wasn't hope exactly, but maybe the possibility of hope. These two women saw her not as a waste of space or a problem to be managed, but as a human being worthy of compassion and care. Over the next few days, as Sarah recovered from her pneumonia, Dr. Walsh and Patricia worked behind the scenes to connect her with resources. Dr. Walsh had contacts at several organizations that specialized in helping trauma survivors, while Patricia knew social workers who understood the unique challenges faced by homeless women. But more than that, they treated Sarah with dignity. They listened to her story without judgment, acknowledged her strength in surviving impossible circumstances, and helped her begin to see herself as more than just a victim. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way back to the world of the living. The scars on her neck would never fully fade, but perhaps they could become reminders of her survival rather than symbols of her destruction. As she lay in the hospital bed, finally, able to rest without fear, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what tomorrow might bring if she found the courage to accept the help being offered. Officer Michael Chun had been walking the downtown beat for 8 years, long enough to recognize most of the regular faces in the homeless community. When he saw Sarah sitting outside the public library 3 weeks after her hospital stay, he almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the hollow-eyed, skeletal figure he remembered from previous encounters. While still thin, she looked healthier, and there was something different about the way she carried herself. Dr. Walsh had connected Sarah with Haven House, a specialized program for domestic violence survivors that provided transitional housing and comprehensive support services. Unlike the overcrowded general shelters, Haven House had trained staff who understood trauma and its long-lasting effects. They had helped Sarah get temporary housing, food assistance, and, most importantly, counseling to begin processing what she had endured. Officer Chin approached cautiously, expecting the usual defensive reaction he got from homeless individuals. But when Sarah looked up at him, her expression was alert and engaged rather than fearful or resigned. "Good morning," she said politely, closing the notebook she had been writing in. I'm not causing any trouble. I was just waiting for the library to open. Chun was struck by the change in her voice. Instead of the barely audible whisper he remembered, she spoke clearly and with confidence. More than that, she had made eye contact, something he realized she had never done in all their previous encounters. I know, he replied, surprised by his own gentleness. Something about this interaction felt different. Are you doing okay? I mean, really okay? Sarah considered the question seriously. A month ago, she would have given an automatic response designed to make him go away. Now, she found herself actually thinking about her answer. I'm getting help, she said finally. Real help. For the first time in a long time. I feel like maybe things could get better. Chin nodded, feeling an unexpected surge of hope. In his years of police work, he had seen too many people caught in cycles of addiction, mental illness, and homelessness that seemed impossible to break. Success stories were rare enough that they stood out like beacons. That's good to hear, he said. Really good to hear. As Chun continued his patrol, he found himself thinking about Sarah and the transformation he had witnessed. He had been drawn to police work because he wanted to help people, but the reality of the job often felt like an endless series of arrests and paperwork with little meaningful impact on the problems he encountered daily. Sarah's case stayed with him throughout the day. When his shift ended, instead of going home, he found himself driving to the police station's records department. He pulled up her file, reading through the history of arrests and encounters that painted a picture of someone spiraling deeper into desperation with each passing month. But now he knew there was more to the story. He thought about the scars Dr. Walsh had mentioned when she called to follow up on Sarah's case. The medical community and law enforcement were supposed to work together, but too often they existed in separate silos, missing opportunities to truly help people caught between systems. Chin made a decision that would change not only Sarah's trajectory, but his own understanding of his role as a police officer. He reached out to Dr. Walsh, asking if they could meet to discuss how law enforcement could better serve trauma survivors like Sarah. Their conversation opened Chin's eyes to the complex web of circumstances that could lead someone from a normal life to homelessness. Dr. Walsh explained how domestic violence survivors often faced unique challenges in accessing traditional services, how trauma affected their ability to navigate bureaucratic systems, and how the criminal justice system sometimes failed both victims and perpetrators. Sarah is brilliant, Dr. Walsh told him. She has a college education, she's articulate and insightful when she feels safe enough to open up. But trauma literally changes your brain chemistry. It affects your ability to make decisions, to trust people, to advocate for yourself. Add malnutrition and sleep deprivation from living on the streets, and it becomes nearly impossible to access the help you need. Chin began to understand that his previous encounters with Sarah hadn't been with someone who was lazy or choosing to be homeless, but with someone whose capacity to help herself had been systematically destroyed by abuse, and then further eroded by the daily violence of life on the streets. Inspired by these insights, Chun volunteered to participate in a new initiative that paired police officers with social workers for calls involving homeless individuals. Instead of the traditional approach of arrest and release, they would try to connect people with appropriate services and support. 2 months later, Chin was called to a disturbance at a downtown fast food restaurant. A man was yelling at customers and staff, clearly in some kind of mental health crisis. When Chin arrived with social worker Maria Santos, they found a situation that could have escalated quickly under normal circumstances. But instead of immediately moving to arrest the man, Chun and Maria worked together to de-escalate the situation. Maria spoke calmly to the individual, identifying that he was having a manic episode and hadn't taken his medication in several days. Rather than handcuffs, the man ended up in an ambulance heading to psychiatric evaluation and treatment. As they wrapped up the call, Chin noticed a familiar figure watching from across the street. Sarah had been shopping at the grocery store next door and had witnessed the entire interaction. She approached them as they finished their paperwork. I saw what you did, she said to Chun. That could have gone very differently. We're trying some new approaches, Chun replied, learning that arresting people doesn't always solve the underlying problems. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I remember when you arrested me that last time, you seemed frustrated. Like you knew it wasn't really helping anything. Chun was surprised by her perception. You noticed that? I notice a lot of things, Sarah said with a slight smile. When you're invisible to most people, you get good at reading the ones who do see you. Maria, who had been listening to their conversation, introduced herself to Sarah. As they talked, Maria learned about Sarah's progress at Haven House and her struggles with finding employment despite her education and skills. Have you considered using your experience to help other people? Maria asked. There's a real need for peer counselors and advocates who understand what it's like to be homeless and to survive trauma. The suggestion sparked something in Sarah that had been dormant for years. Since her mother's death, she had felt like her life had no purpose beyond mere survival. But the idea of using her painful experiences to help others appealed to something deep within her. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Sarah admitted. I'm still figuring out how to help myself. That's exactly what makes you qualified, Maria replied. You understand the journey because you're still on it. Over the following weeks, Maria introduced Sarah to other peer counselors and advocates in the community. Sarah attended support groups where she met other domestic violence survivors who were at different stages of their recovery journeys. She began to see that healing wasn't a linear process and that her own struggles didn't disqualify her from helping others. Meanwhile, Chun continued his partnership with social workers, becoming increasingly skilled at recognizing the difference between criminal behavior and behavior driven by trauma, mental illness, or desperation. He started carrying resource cards with information about shelters, mental health services, addiction treatment, and domestic violence support. One evening, Chun was called to investigate a report of someone trespassing in an abandoned building. When he arrived, he found a young woman about Sarah's age huddled in a corner, clearly terrified. Instead of immediately ordering her to leave, Chun sat down at a distance and began talking quietly. My name is Mike, he said. I'm a police officer, but I'm not here to arrest you unless you've done something dangerous. Can you tell me your name? The woman, who gave her name as Jessica, gradually opened up about fleeing an abusive boyfriend who had threatened to kill her if she tried to leave. She had been living in abandoned buildings for 3 days, too afraid to go to a shelter where he might find her. Chun called Maria, and together they were able to connect Jessica with Haven House, the same program that had helped Sarah. As they drove Jessica to safety, Chun thought about how different this encounter was from his arrests of Sarah 2 months earlier. Instead of criminalizing someone's desperation, they were addressing its root causes. The next day, Chun called Dr. Walsh to share Jessica's story and to ask if Sarah might be willing to speak with the new resident. Dr. Walsh contacted Sarah, who agreed to visit Haven House as a peer mentor. When Sarah walked into the common room at Haven House, she saw Jessica sitting alone on a couch, her arms wrapped around herself in a posture of protection that Sarah recognized immediately. The young woman's eyes darted toward the exits, cataloging escape routes in case she needed to run. Hi, Sarah said softly, sitting down across from Jessica, but leaving plenty of space between them. My name is Sarah. I heard you just got here. Jessica nodded warily, studying Sarah's face for signs of judgment or pity. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected, understanding. This place helped save my life, Sarah continued. Not just by giving me a roof over my head, but by helping me remember that I'm worth saving. You're worth saving too. For the next hour, Sarah shared parts of her own story, carefully gauging Jessica's reactions and only revealing what felt appropriate. She talked about the progression from control to violence in her relationship with Marcus, about the shame and isolation that made it impossible to ask for help, about the way trauma had affected her thinking and decision-making abilities. I thought I was going crazy, Jessica whispered. He would do something to hurt me, then tell me it never happened. He said I was making things up, that I was too sensitive, that I brought it on myself. That's called gaslighting, Sarah explained. It's a form of psychological abuse designed to make you doubt your own perceptions. It's not in your head. It's a real thing that abusers do deliberately. Having a name for what she had experienced was profoundly validating for Jessica. For months, she had wondered if she was losing her mind, if her memories could be trusted, if she was as unstable as her boyfriend claimed. As their conversation continued, Sarah found herself accessing knowledge and insights she hadn't realized she possessed. Her own journey through trauma and recovery had taught her things that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training programs. She understood the specific fears, shame, and confusion that Jessica was experiencing because she had lived through them herself. When their visit ended, Sarah felt energized in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Helping Jessica had reminded her of her own strength and resilience. She realized that her experiences, as painful as they had been, could serve a purpose beyond her own healing. 1 year later, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the annual conference on homelessness and trauma-informed care. She wore a simple blue dress that she had bought with her first paycheck as a certified peer counselor, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly proud of who she was becoming. The scars on her neck were still visible, thin white lines that would never completely fade. But instead of hiding them with high collars, Sarah had learned to wear them as evidence of her survival. They told a story not of victimhood, but of endurance and, ultimately, transformation. 2 years ago, she began, her voice clear and strong. I was arrested for the 4th time in 6 months. The officers who processed me thought I was just another addict, another problem person taking up space and resources. I thought the same thing about myself. In the audience, Officer Chin sat with Dr. Walsh, Patricia from the emergency room, and Maria, the social worker. They had all come to hear Sarah speak, each of them having played a crucial role in her journey from the streets to this stage. What none of us understood at the time, Sarah continued, was that homelessness was not my problem. Homelessness was a symptom of my actual problems, which were trauma, poverty, and a system that wasn't designed to help people like me. Sarah had spent the past year working as a peer counselor at Haven House, while completing coursework to become a certified addiction counselor and trauma specialist. She had also become an advocate, working with local government officials to develop more effective responses to homelessness and domestic violence. The program that Chun had helped pilot, pairing police officers with social workers, had been so successful that it was being expanded citywide. Arrests for quality-of-life violations had decreased by 60%, while successful connections to services had increased by over 200%. Officer Chun is here tonight, Sarah said, gesturing toward the audience. He probably doesn't remember this, but the last time he arrested me, I could see the frustration in his eyes. Not frustration with me personally, but with a system that asked him to arrest the same people over and over again without addressing why they kept ending up in the same situations. Chun shifted uncomfortably, still adjusting to being praised for work he had initially seen as just doing his job better. Sarah's recognition meant more to him than any commendation from his superiors because it came from someone whose life had been directly impacted by the changes they had implemented. Dr. Walsh and Nurse Patricia are also here, Sarah continued, looking toward the medical professionals who had first seen past her circumstances to her humanity. They saved my life in ways that went far beyond treating my pneumonia. They saw my scars and, instead of making assumptions, they asked questions. They listened to my answers. And they connected me with people who could help. Dr. Walsh wiped away a tear, remembering that night in the emergency room when Sarah had finally told her story. It had taken courage for Sarah to trust them with her truth, and it had taken persistence to connect her with appropriate resources. Seeing her now, confident and purposeful, made every difficult case worth it. But the person who really saved me, Sarah said, her voice growing softer, was a young woman named Jessica. When I first visited her at Haven House 6 months ago, I thought I was there to help her. What I discovered was that helping her helped me remember who I was before the trauma, before the homelessness, before I lost myself completely. Jessica was in the audience too, now 6 months into her own recovery journey, and working part-time while attending community college. She had moved from Haven House into transitional housing and was planning to start volunteering as a peer counselor herself. The cycle of healing was expanding, creating ripples that touched more lives with each connection. Trauma-informed care isn't just about treating people nicely, Sarah explained to the audience of service providers, law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and government officials. It's about understanding that behavior that looks irrational or self-destructive often makes perfect sense when you understand what someone has been through. She talked about hypervigilance and how it made it difficult for trauma survivors to sit with their backs to doors or to trust people in positions of authority. She explained how shame and self-blame could prevent people from accessing services even when they desperately needed help. She described how the constant stress of survival made long-term planning nearly impossible. When you're focused on finding a safe place to sleep tonight, Sarah said, you can't think about job interviews next week or apartment applications next month. Maslow's hierarchy of needs isn't just theory, it's reality. You can't address someone's unemployment until you've addressed their housing, their safety, their basic physical needs. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Many of them had worked with homeless populations for years, but hearing Sarah's perspective gave them new insights into the effectiveness of their approaches. Sarah then shared some of the innovative programs that had emerged from collaboration between service providers, law enforcement, and people with lived experience. Mobile crisis teams that included peer counselors could respond to mental health emergencies without automatically involving arrests. Housing First programs that provided immediate shelter without requiring sobriety or compliance with treatment programs had shown remarkable success rates. We've learned that meeting people where they are, rather than where we think they should be, creates better outcomes for everyone, Sarah explained. When Jessica first came to Haven House, she wasn't ready to leave her abusive relationship permanently. She just needed a safe place to think. If we had required her to commit to never going back to him, she might not have stayed long enough to realize she had other options. The approach Sarah described represented a fundamental shift in how society could respond to complex social problems. Instead of punitive measures that blamed individuals for their circumstances, trauma-informed care looked at root causes and provided comprehensive support. After her presentation, Sarah was surrounded by audience members wanting to learn more about implementing similar programs in their own communities. A police chief from a neighboring city wanted to know how to train her officers in trauma recognition. A hospital administrator asked about protocols for identifying domestic violence survivors. A city councilman inquired about funding models for comprehensive support services. But the conversation that meant the most to Sarah came from a young woman who approached her as the crowd was dispersing. She was probably in her early 20s, well-dressed and articulate, but Sarah recognized something familiar in her eyes. "Thank you for sharing your story," the woman said quietly. "I'm not homeless, but the other stuff, the relationship stuff, I think I need help." Sarah took her aside, and they talked for nearly an hour. The young woman, whose name was Amanda, described a pattern of control and psychological abuse that was escalating toward physical violence. She had been making excuses for her boyfriend's behavior, believing his promises to change, and gradually isolating herself from friends and family who expressed concerns. "I keep thinking maybe I'm overreacting," Amanda said. "He says I'm too sensitive, that I take things the wrong way. When I listen to your story, though, I recognize things he does." Sarah gave Amanda information about local resources and her own contact information. More importantly, she validated Amanda's perceptions and helped her understand that recognizing abuse early didn't make her problems less serious than someone who had endured years of violence. "You don't have to wait until you're homeless or in the hospital to deserve help," Sarah told her. "You don't have to prove how bad things are by enduring worse things. You deserve to be safe and respected right now." A week later, Amanda called Sarah to say she had moved in with a friend and was working with a counselor to develop a safety plan. She was taking the first steps toward leaving her abusive relationship while she still had support systems and resources intact. That conversation reinforced for Sarah why her work mattered. By sharing her story publicly, she was reaching not just service providers and policymakers, but potentially preventing other women from experiencing the devastating losses she had endured. As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 2 years ago, she had been arrested and dismissed as a waste of space. Tonight, she had addressed an auditorium full of professionals who hung on her every word and sought her expertise. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear. There had been setbacks and dark days when the progress felt fragile. But each small step had built upon the previous one, creating momentum that eventually became unstoppable. Sarah's apartment was small, but it was hers. On the walls hung her community college diploma, her peer counselor certification, and the first newspaper article that had featured her work. But the item she treasured most was a worn photograph of her mother, the same one she had carried with her through the darkest days on the streets. "I think you'd be proud, Mom," she whispered to the photograph before turning off the lights. As she settled into her own bed for the night, Sarah thought about Jessica, about Amanda, about all the women who were still fighting their way out of situations that seemed impossible to escape. Tomorrow she would continue the work of helping them remember their own worth and strength. The scars on her neck had become symbols not of her destruction, but of her resilience. They reminded her daily that survival was possible, that healing was possible, and that sometimes the people society dismisses as worthless are exactly the ones who can change the world. Officer Chin's shift ended at midnight, and he completed his paperwork thinking about Sarah's speech and the changes they had implemented together. In his patrol car, he now carried cards for domestic violence services, mental health resources, and addiction treatment programs. More importantly, he carried a different understanding of his role in the community. Dr. Walsh finished her emergency room shift knowing that the next homeless patient who came through their doors would receive not just medical treatment, but compassionate care informed by everything Sarah had taught them about trauma and survival. And in apartments and shelters across the city, women who had heard Sarah's story that night fell asleep with a little more hope than they had carried in months or years. They had heard from someone who understood their experiences, who had survived the unsurvivable, and who was living proof that tomorrow could be different from today. Sarah's journey from the streets to the stage had taken 2 years, but the impact of her transformation would ripple outward for decades to come, touching lives in ways she might never fully know but would always feel grateful to have made possible.